Hey everybody, welcome to Ancient Texts. I'm your host, Jeremy Richard, and today we're going to go over a quick history of the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth takes place around 1250 BC during the time of the Judges, and the events likely took place during the time of Gideon's war with the Midianites. And just to get a slightly better idea of where we're at, Moses lived around 1500 BC, and King David lived around 1000 BC. The main characters of the story are Elimelech and Naomi. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Those two sons married two women, Ruth and Orpah, who were both Moabites. More on that later. Elimelech has a close relative called the nearer kinsman, and then he's also got a relative that's slightly farther away, known as Boaz. Boaz ends up marrying Ruth in our story. Elimelech and Naomi were from Bethlehem in Israel, and lived in the land designated for the tribe of Judah. But there was a famine in the land, so Elimelech sold his land and went to Moab to try to make a life there. But before we move on with the story, we need to cover how ancient Israelis conducted real estate transactions. One of their laws regarding real estate was called the Law of Redemption of the Land. Today, when we sell land, we usually sell it fee simple, meaning that the new owner has unrestricted access to the property. In reality, you never actually own the land anyway, you own the rights to the land. Many real estate transactions will transfer the rights to live on the land, but may retain the mineral rights, for example. But in ancient Israel, selling your land was more what we would think of as a lease. The land was supposed to always stay within the tribe, and thus could never be fully sold, and all land would revert back to their original owners and their descendants in the year of Jubilee. As such, a provision was put into the law by God that if you sold your land, there must be a mechanism where you or a near kinsman could buy the land back, called redeeming the land. Title deeds in ancient Israel were written on both sides for this reason. On the inside of the scroll were all the physical properties of the land, including size, assets, buildings, you name it. Then the scroll was rolled up and sealed, and on the outside of the scroll were written the terms and conditions that could be met for a near kinsman to purchase the land back for the original seller. See Jeremiah 32 for a detailed description. Back to our story. Our family is in Moab when tragedy strikes and Elimelech dies. Naomi then marries her two sons to two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, but then, surprisingly, sickly and pining also die. Orpah decides that she's staying in Moab, and Ruth famously follows Naomi back to her native land of Israel. Two things happen when Ruth and Naomi get back to Bethlehem. Everyone in the town recognizes Naomi is without her husband and sons, and the town is also abuzz about who the Moabite woman is. The two women are destitute and rely on the law of gleaning for survival. This was ancient Israel's system of welfare. Specific instructions were given to the farmers who reaped in the fields to let the poor glean from the corners and anything the reapers dropped. Note that the poor still had to go out and work for their food. So Ruth just happens upon the field of Boaz during the barley harvest. Boaz notices her and asks his foreman, who is that? And he tells him that she's the Moabite woman that came into town with Naomi. So Boaz tells Ruth to glean only in his field because he's heard how selflessly Ruth had stuck by her mother-in-law, even to the point of moving to a strange land. And he also tells his workers to drop extra food for her. When Ruth gets home with her oodles of barley, Naomi is shocked and asks her, "Where did you get all that?" "Boaz," Ruth replies, and that sets Naomi's gears to working, while for the next few months, Ruth continues to glean from the barley harvest in March to the wheat harvest in May. Naomi tells Ruth that Boaz is a near kinsman. He's wealthy, he's strong, and quite good looking, so she tries to set them up at the threshing floor. So that night, at the threshing floor, Ruth follows Naomi's instructions to the letter. She does it at night and when nobody can see because she's a Moabite, and that's important, but we'll get to that in a minute. In the middle of the night, she uncovers his feet, and he wakes up because his feet are cold, and he sees Ruth at his feet. She asks him what she wants, and she replies, "Spread the hem of your garment over me." He knows exactly what this means. She's asking him to be her and Naomi's kinsman redeemer. Boaz tells her that he'd love to, but there's a nearer kinsman, so there's the snag. If that guy wants to act as a redeemer, he most certainly could. But our hero has a plan, and he gives Ruth 6 units of barley to give to Naomi, and Naomi knows exactly what this means. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, but on the 7th day he rested. Boaz was sending a signal to Naomi that he wouldn't rest until the matter was settled. Spread the hem of your garment over me. In ancient times, the hem represented authority. In Mesopotamia, cutting off the hem was to strip one of personality and authority. A husband could divorce his wife by cutting off the hem of her robe. A nobleman could authenticate his signature by pressing his unique hem on a clay tablet. David removed King Saul's hem. And there were the fringes for the Levitical garments. In God's covenant with Israel, God says of Israel, I will spread my skirt over you. It's the same concept. Jesus' him, his authority, was sought by the woman with the issue of blood. Let's take a pause to talk about the final law in our story, the law of levirate marriage. The man that had to perform this had to be a near kinsman, but he also had to be able to perform the duties, i.e. not already married. He also had to be willing, and it was not required, and he had to accept all the obligations that came along with the marriage. If he refused, he had to take off his shoe and give it to her because he was not standing up to his obligations. Boaz has a problem, and his problem is that Ruth is a Moabite. If you'll remember back in Genesis 19, the Moabites were the result of Lot's daughters and their incestuous relationship when they got him drunk. The Moabites later on hired the prophet Balaam to curse Israel, and they had a number of other run-ins and problems with Israel. As such, Moabites were strictly forbidden by law in the public life of Israel. So Boaz had to figure out a way to get Ruth. So the next morning, Boaz gets up, he goes to the city gate, he gets the nearer kinsman, and he tells 10 of the elders, sit down, we're going to have a meeting and we're going to hash this out. So Boaz asks the nearer kinsman if he wants to perform the duty, and he's like, yeah, I'm down with that. And then he says, oh, by the way, she's a Moabite, and your firstborn is going to be Elimelech's heir and not your heir. And thus his trick is played and the gambit pays off. The nearer kinsman relinquishes his hold and gives Boaz the legal okay to be the kinsman redeemer, to redeem the land for Elimelech, and to marry Ruth. Boaz and Ruth get married, he redeems the land, all is well. They have a son named Obed, Obed has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David, who later becomes the king of Israel. And now that our story's done, let's talk about some types and shadows that are clearly in the text. The first one is Naomi. She represents Israel. In order for Ruth to learn about the kinsman redeemer, Naomi had to be exiled from her land. And what the law could not do, grace did. Ruth does not replace Naomi. And Ruth actually meets Boaz through Naomi. And Boaz confronts the nearer kinsman, not Ruth. Ruth represents the church. She's a Gentile bride of a Jew in the royal line. The book of Ruth is always read at the Feast of Pentecost, or Shavuot as the Jews call it, the day the church was born. Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, a foreshadow of Jesus. He takes a Gentile bride, the church, and he redeems the land for Naomi, Israel. So remember earlier when we talked about title deeds and how they had writing on both sides of the scroll? Let's take that knowledge and go dive into Revelation 5:1. And then I saw in the right hand of the one who sits on the throne a scroll written on the inside and on the outside, sealed with 7 seals. Realize what this is. This is the title deed to the earth, and Jesus is finally claiming what he paid for with his blood some 2,000 years ago on a hill in Judea.